We could spend an hour on tabs versus spaces if you'd prefer.
Tabs.
Yeah, definitely tabs. I mean, no
Spaces.
question. But oh, please, that's just like a waste of energy. Preserve your knuckles, people. Like, you need to use them for a long time.
Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. This episode is brought to you by Rollbar. Move fast and fix things. Resolve errors in minutes and deploy with confidence. Head to rollbar.com/changelog. Request a demo. Get started today. It's loved by developers, trusted by enterprises, and most of all, we use it here at Changelog. Move fast and fix things with Rollbar. Once again, rollbar.com/changelog.
You are listening to JS Party, a weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. We record live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, and you should join in on the hijinks. It's absolutely free at changelog.com/community. Hop in our Slack, hit up the JS Party channel. The bigger the live party, the better. If this is your first time listening, make sure you subscribe at changelog.com/JS Party or wherever you get your podcasts. It's party time, y'all. Oh, yes, it's time once again, friends. It's time for JS Party. I'm Jared. I'm your friend, and I'm joined by some of my friends. Nick Nisi joins us today. What's up, Nick?
Hoi, hoi.
Ahoy, ahoy.
And Amel Hussein is back. What's up, Amel?
Hey, everyone.
And we are also joined by a special guest, Yanni Goldberg, the curator, creator, and maintainer of the Node Best Practices repo on GitHub. Yanni, thanks for coming on JS Party.
Thanks for inviting me. So happy to be here.
Yes, we are happy to have you, and we're happy to learn and discuss from you. You have this really cool set of Node best practices, which a lot of these repos on GitHub start off cool, and then they just kind of fall into disrepair or non-maintenance. And one thing that's impressed me about this repo is that you've kept it up to date and active over time. So give us the lowdown on this, where it came from, why you started it, and what's going on with this project.
Sure. So it all goes back to when I was a .NET developer, like 15 years ago. Microsoft has a team that was called the Patterns and Practices team. They was kind of inspiring everyone how to write code. And the entire .NET community followed their advice. And I kind of admired them. I wanted to be part of the Patterns and Practices tools. This didn't happen, but once I switched to Node.js land, there was almost no practices and understanding how you build an application. Unlike Java, Ruby have a very strong opinion on the application structure. So this was my chance to be the patterns and practices of Node.js. I put a lot of effort into it, and to an extent, it worked.
Yeah, it's interesting when you have a brand new ecosystem spring out of nowhere and go into such a place of use, right? Like it became from very small start, just exploding and used in so many different ways in enterprises and hobbies that there's opportunity, right? In them hills is like, okay, I can be the best practices guy if I just go ahead and put the effort in. And did you come up with the best practices? Did you find them from other people? Where does the actual content come from? Out of your brain?
Partially, it was a mix between things that are common knowledge for in other platforms, and you should just import them into Node.js land. Other stuff needs some adaptation into the Node.js world because Node has some special characteristics and behavior. So some of the stuff needed to be adjusted, and there was also quite a bit opinionated decision to make, like, what is the right architecture for Node.js? Is it one from the Java world or from the Ruby ecosystem? So it was a mix of different type of contents and decision to make. I guess we'll speak about this very soon.
Yeah, I have to say that makes sense to me, that ultimately there's a general set of security best practices. I think of that list. What was it? WASP. I can't even pronounce it. what's that community that sends out the top 10 threats every year?
Mm-hmm.
OWASP?
Yes. So there's generally like best practices within security, but I think for me, what I'd love to hear from you on is there are things that are unique to server-side JavaScript being a novel thing, and then also just like the youngness of this ecosystem, as well as a lot of the cultural baggage that I think JavaScript developers have around like move fast and break things. I think JavaScript security is like a unique challenge, right? Because I think it's the hardest group of nerds to herd, because ultimately it's also the biggest community, period. And then I think, the server-side shift, like it was very fast and furious, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think like there's this whole swath of, and for me, like Node is very much like a Legoland community, right? Like it's you have to build your own modules and you create your own storyboard. But there's so many challenges with Node because there aren't it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot, right? Like there aren't like strong conventions there. And that's how you see things like the loopback and tools like Happy.js, they kind of have come in to kind of, I think, fill that need, like the conventions gap. And so what have been some challenges for you there?
I totally agree. Mostly about it's being Legoland where everyone has to craft and reinvent sometimes the wheels. I think that in terms of security, there are two things that makes Node.js security more challenging than other platforms. One, as you said, I believe, is the maturity. There are not yet enough set of tools to address all the concerns. For an example, if you want to limit your process permissions, it's not very easy with Node. By the way, this is one of the selling points of Dino, the so-called Node replacement. We are more secured. And I guess there is a reason why Ryan Dahl, the creator of this of Dino, choose security as one of his differentiator. The second point is the single thread thing. Which we all know, Node.js, at least there is one thread that serves users. And when you have one thread, it's much easier to attack your code. Because if this thread is gone, at least a big part of your service is gone. So this is what makes security in Node.js. Security is always challenging, but in Node.js, it's even a bit more.
Mm. So the plan for this episode is we're going to try to treat this in three segments, three sections. Now, there's lots of best practices. There's lots of areas. And full disclosure, Yanni's favorite area is testing. In fact, when I said, hey, come talk about Node best practices with us, he was like, are you sure? Because I could talk about testing. And I was like, no, I'm sure. But maybe we'll do testing again later. So we're going to go to a deep dive on testing. We have a lot of testing advocates on the panel. But we're going to start off with writing our code. And then we're going to talk about testing the code a little bit and then also securing the code. So lest we get too far ahead of ourselves in the securing section, let's go through some of the best practices laid out in this guide for how you go about writing your code. As we've stated before, a lot of this stuff is really what I consider, Wild West for a while, cowboy land of like, well, how do you like to do it, right? And over time, these things start to develop and you realize this is worse or this is better. And people come to these conventions. So when it comes to writing code, Yanni, what do you have in the best practices or what has the community landed on in terms of project structure, error handling, style, etc. for Node code?
Yeah, so I picked some of the, I think, more impactful and important practices for writing code. Although I must admit, the bullets that has the most traction and flammable discussion was about semicolons or not, brackets, but I think that we better focus here on things that are more painful and impactful.
We could spend an hour on tabs versus spaces if you'd prefer.
Tabs.
Yeah, definitely tabs. I mean, no
Spaces.
question. But oh, please, that's just like a waste of energy. Preserve your knuckles, people. You need to use them for a long time. Yanni, just to confirm, when you said the semicolon, are you talking about like ASI being automatic semicolon insertion? I'm just curious why semicolons play into the security story at all.
Yeah. So first here I'm more referring not yet to the security part, whether to writing code in general.
Just coding style.
Yeah.
Okay, coding style. Sorry, I clearly I'm foaming at the mouth to talk about security.
She's already in segment 3.
I am going to unfurl myself and let's talk about writing code.
To semicolon or not to semicolon is definitely like a thing, right?
Oh, for sure. That's a thing. Yeah. I was at NPM and we used standard at NPM. And it was like the first time I've had to write code without semicolons. And it was a big adjustment, especially because I'm very familiar with like the traps of ASI being automatic semicolon insertion. So it's like, I was always just like, am I going to take down the registry? Am I going to like break all the builds? Like, you know,
Valid concerns.
Valid.
No, but it was really funny because we could write like highly opinionated and controversial stuff like, hey, you should all use Oracle database. And people like, okay, but if we write, you should use semicolon in the end, those kind of hundreds comments discussions. So
right.
we learned to run away from these flammable discussions. Anyway, so about writing code, I think that the first best practice that I picked is distinguishing between what are catastrophic errors versus non-catastrophic errors, because in a single threaded land, making a decision when to make your thread crash is really impactful. There are other 1,000 users now on the line. If you make the thread crash, then the damage is huge. So when I started with Node.js, the advice was, if you have an unfamiliar error, you should just let the thread crash. Why? It's just safer. You don't know what are the implications of the error if it's not familiar. Maybe you have some critical zombie component, like database connections that is hanging. So better be safe, crash. Okay, this is what I started with. And then when I worked with customers, I always put that line, process.exit, if the error is unknown, process.exit. And the funny part is that almost everyone, after weeks, someone commented out this line. Like I got back 2 months later, looked at the GitHub repository, someone deleted this line. And the reality just told us that in most of the time, the errors are not really catastrophic and affecting all the process, but killing a thread is really painful in production and so many times. So after some times, I adjusted my practice and I suggest go with the balanced approach. If the error comes with, that is originated from a specific request, like a specific HTTP request, it is probably not catastrophic. This is just something that happened during the request. Yes, it's a risk, but staying alive, make the thread stay alive is educated guess. On the other end, if the error happened during a critical phase, like the startup or something regarding to some global object like the database error connection, it's probably catastrophic crash. And this happy medium, based on my experience, works better for most of my customers.
So is this information or guide specific to like server apps as opposed to like, I don't know, command line apps or something? Because there is a lot to pass when you exit, like with a specific error code, for example, if you want to like pipe that into another process or something for like command line apps. So is this kind of more focused towards server-side apps?
Absolutely, because a server-side thread probably at the moment is serving 1,000 users. So only to get the exit code to now let down 1,000 users, doesn't make sense. You can just properly log the error, get it to the ops systems, and stay alive. So
yeah, so I mean, this is really kind of fascinating because I feel like I've had a very similar evolution, except for I think for me it ties very much into the logging story, right? Because I think for me, I really I'm a data freak, so I love monitoring and logging and classifying my errors and making sure that if there's something new that's out of bounds, like I'm notified right away, right? And we're able to hop on it. And that's kind of like the triage process. And so I think for me, it's very interesting. Like, I'm not sure I'm fully on board with the like universally just don't crash, right? Like ultimately, like things like the DB, if there's like memory issues or if there's like flushes that you didn't do, like the system's gonna crash anyway, right? Like it's gonna crash on its own, whether you explicitly exit or not. But I think for me, especially during development and testing and staging, like, I don't know, I would err on trying to collect as many of those data points and making sure that whatever logger you're using, that you have event listeners set up on process exit and crash, like so that you can capture that stack and that error, like, you know what I mean? So that you're able to send it somewhere, like put it on disk and whatever. If you have a log rotate policy, or if you're using like a FluentD or something like that, that you're able to kind of capture that data, right? So like for me, like, where does that come into play for you? You know, like the logging story and the monitoring story and the triaging, like how does that kind of fit into that flow? Because I think for me, without kind of a rubric there, it's very hard to implement any type of universal guideline, right? Like at least for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the ops involvement here, the monitoring, the logging, the other side of the error handling, the one that should take some proactive act is a really important piece of the puzzle. This is, by the way, another reason why you should not always and blindly crash. Remember, there are people there watching the applications. They might make thoughtful decisions. If you decide to crash based on one error that you have, and then you make the thread crash all the time, congrats, you now have two problems. Very soon we will discuss the next best practice is about metrics and how to visualize your application health. So,
yeah. So, okay. So it ties in over there.
I think it makes sense to think of those as distinct, and it's like your development practices are allowing for your ops practices to get what they need, right? And that may still be you. That may still be the same person, but if it's not, it scales well. And so one of those things, Yoni, as we go down the list here, you have extend the built-in error object. You want to tell us more about that?
Sure. And I guess it's complementary to the first one. We're building the story here. So the idea is that anytime you throw an error, you should throw only in your object that inherits from the base JavaScript error and not anything else. There are two groups that I believe are doing it wrong. The first one, in JavaScript, you can throw anything. In JavaScript, you can throw an integer, you can throw a Boolean. I guess you can throw an emoji of unicorn.
You can throw a party, which is what we do here every Thursday.
That's kind of how we handle it.
1 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah.
JavaScript party.
Some people think it's an error, but we don't think so.
At least not a code one. Yeah.
It's a custom error.
That's right. It's our error, okay?
Yeah. So I guess it's obvious to everyone why this is wrong. You lose the stack trace, it's obvious. But the other type of mistake is so popular. And going by this mistake is when you throw the error object of JavaScript. And I see it in many places, and even the Node.js core was doing this for a while. So the idea is that you just include a very long message. And then once you need to handle the error, reason about it, and act, you have to compare with a very, very long string. And if someone just changed a word in this string, then million application in the world breaks because they relied on this specific string. Not to mention that many people, it was a funny thing to observe, many people install a localized version of Node.js. So the error messages change per language. They are localized.
Wow.
So yeah, at some point the Node.js core realized it. Maybe they already done it, I don't know. They switched to what I propose. And not because of me, by the way. The idea is that to include in every error object some identifier property, a name, a code, something that strongly identifies the error. And then it's very easy to reason about the error type and compare.
So if I were to reiterate and just make sure I'm following you, don't throw the standard error, like don't throw the non-custom error, but also don't customize the crap out of your errors. Like have some classifiers for types of errors. So you're suggesting some structure of your error messages, but not like a hierarchy or like extreme unique errors for each circumstance. Is that what you're saying, or am I not following?
I believe that there are two valid practices here. One of them is just inherit from the base error object and add at least one property that identifies the error, like name, code, and then you can write there things like invalid input, payment failed, whatever.
Right.
The second type of implementation, which is valid, is creating a different class per error type. Then you achieve the same goal. You can identify the error type quite easily. It's just more verbose and demands more work, but I guess valid as well.
Yeah, it's just functional versus composition, right?
Right.
For me, it's very clear when logging and trying to capture errors or any type of logs within your application, you really need to kind of have like a standard format. And I think like that's kind of what Yoni is alluding to. But also for me, there's a very clear core set of things that I log for, right? That being like that unique event name, right? Or in this case, unique error name that's like a string that's tied to some constant or enum in my system, as well as like, what service did this come from? What, like there's a set of core things you want in every error. And the way I handle for dynamic data, right? Dynamic data being like anything else that I want to capture where the error happened, whether it's arguments, whether it's like additional context or any other data that's contextual beyond the stack trace, which is a standard item. I use a specific key, something like payload or data, and I put everything in that object, right? So even the dynamic data has a standard format, right? And you kind of get away from that. Like I 100% relate to the example that you used around the string matching, and anybody changes that format, all of a sudden everything breaks. It's ridiculous, especially when Splunking, people are Splunking on crazy string formats. I'm like, Jesus Christ, like just use a data structure that like makes sense, So yeah, I plus a million on that.
All right, let's move on to the next one. We have layer your code with N tiers. That means you have to cry the whole time, or what's that mean? That's a terrible pun. It says on creating N-tier style of architecture. So this has to do with the actual layering and styling of the architecture of the code. And you have best practices on this as well.
Yeah, this is about the project structure, project architecture, or practically the folder structure in your application. This type of discussions are always opinionated. And when I started, I thought to myself, do I want to get into this? And I decided that yes, because there were no standards at all at Node.js land back then about how do I build application. Mm-hmm. And obviously, I wouldn't invent anything new, but my debates were between choosing the heaviest architecture, Java style, like hexagonal, clean, onion, those are the architecturals that have many, many moving parts and a lot of interface, and it's really heavy stuff. I don't want to now elaborate a lot about architecture like hexagonal. The other option was Ruby style architecture like MVC, which was quite popular when Node.js started. Mm-hmm. I believe that Node needs something between the overstructured architectures of Java to the what I believe are the understructured MVC, something in the middle, some EP medium. The reason, by the way, that I believe that MVC is understructured and not powerful enough, I believe it was Uncle Bob who said that MVC is a delivery pattern. It's not a way to architect your backend. It says nothing about how you structure your business logic, your data access layer, your services, facade, access to other services. All of this, by the way, in MVC falls under the letter M.
Model. Yeah.
Yeah, it's everything is a model. Everything never meant to answer this question. N-tier is a great medium between having something that is make great separation between the API, the entry point. Let me emphasize about what is N-tiers.
Yeah.
N-tier architecture simply mean that you have layers. In plain JavaScript, in Node.js, a layer is just a folder. And then as your request, think about some API request flying in. It just goes through, for example, 3 different layers. The first one is the entry point, like API. So you have one folder with only API-related code, only your routes, only thing related to receiving the request. Then your second layer is the business logic or the domain. This is where you apply custom data change, logic, orchestrating if you need to call other services, everything that is, as the name said, the business logic of your application. And then the third folder, the third tier is the data access. If you have an ORM, this is where it goes to. So you have a very simple and clean separation of concern, but it's also very intuitive. This is also how the request is physically going from API to some logic to our database. So I chose this architecture as a good medium. And what do you think about the reasons that led me to this proposal?
I have thoughts on this, but I want to hear from Nick and Jared. I'm calling it MCD for the record. Or I should say CMD, Controller Model Data. access or CMDA. How about that?
It's a work in progress.
Model, yeah. I mean, hey, you're getting an insight into my brain right now.
Yeah.
So it's controller, model, data access layer, maybe.
That's good. CMDLA.
CMDLA. I was going to say CMDLA. Let's call it. Yeah.
Nick, what do you think about it? You've got boots on the ground in big node applications. Is this a pattern that you've seen? Do you like this idea of these tiers versus a MVC or something even more strict and heavy?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Yoni, but I feel like this is kind of the architecture pattern that like a Nest.js application would use. If you're familiar with that, that's what I have a lot of experience with lately. And breaking everything up into controllers, then are basically like the API endpoints that then have talk to services that have all of the business logic, and then going into, like in our case, a type ORM backend to access the data and manipulate that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Years later, Nest.js did a very similar thing. I think that what Nest has resembles more than anything else, kind of N-tiers approach. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I feel like Express also did this really well initially many years ago. I just don't think they did as, maybe, I don't want to say good of a job. That's not the right word.
Right.
What was kind of not as defined was like the kind of separation of concerns between models and data access, right? So I don't think we ever really had a very good early pattern for that in the Node community. It's just like a bunch of conventions like that were not similar across the board between teams.
And I come from a Ruby on Rails background back in the day, so I was thick into MVC, and I always thought it made a lot of sense with the problems that Yoni stated, that most developers thought that those three words were the only place where you could put your code, and so maybe it was for a lack of structure, which is why the M became it all. Like everything's in the model, and then there's backlash to that, which was the skinny models, fat controllers idiom, or no, sorry. The controllers got too fat. Anyways, you're supposed to have skinny controller. I don't know. I can't remember. Too long ago.
Yeah.
Point was
skinny controllers, fat models.
Because everything was getting shoved into the controllers, and it's like, well, you should shove it into the models. Well, then we ended up with these really fat models, and I never, at a personal level, felt the pain, but I saw the pain in so many Rails projects where it was just became unwieldy, and I think it was because there was just not enough buckets laid out, even though. Spoiler alert, you can create your own buckets. You don't have, like you said, this is not about that, but I haven't done N-tiers, so I'm very interested in checking out what Nest is up to. And are there other projects or open source things or people using this tiered approach where you could say, here's a code base, check it out, here's what it looks like?
No, and this is something that
No.
yeah.
Dang
I
it.
mean, this is the sincere answer, and I said. We've been asked so many times to provide an example application, and I just didn't have the time. So
Right.
I definitely plan to.
Yeah, maybe one of our listeners can help contribute to that.
That would be really powerful.
Is there like an open issue that we can link in the show notes, or should we create one so people can chime in? I'm just curious, like, where are you tracking that backlog work?
The backlog work, you mean of the repository, right?
Yes. These feature requests to kind of like provide an example.
Right. So like the Node best practices repo would be cool if it linked out to examples of this in practice. So maybe creating that example would be the first step, maybe in the GitHub issues for that repo, or if you have a separate way where the community says, I'm sure there's debates on which best practices to add or remove or change. So maybe a place where you could go and say, here are things that need to be done to improve this set of best practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first we do manage all the backlog and issues in GitHub. And there was a handful of discussion about this. We actually have an example, some hidden examples there. It never matured enough that we felt confident enough to share it. But if any of the audience wants to get a quick look into an example that is not finalized, feel free to approach in GitHub, and I'll be glad to share with you the link.
That's awesome. Thanks, Yoni. So just one last question before we kind of wrap this topic. So, I was really, I think what Jared said earlier about like people feeling constrained by these letters, right? These MVC letters, which were really kind of very, maybe not so fully baked ideas,
Or part of the story.
Yeah, it was part of the story. It was a suggestion, first try. So I'm just curious, like, a lot of our listeners work on front-end applications as well as back-end, but like, For folks that are, working on progressively thicker clients, right? Is there an N tiers kind of mirror model for browser code that's written in JavaScript or TypeScript?
Well, I guess you can structure it makes sense for everything. I guess you can structure your front-end code with N tiers, because also in front-end, there are like multiple big concerns, which are good candidates for partitioning the front-end. But as we also, the movement in the front-end world, the state thing gets most of the attention.
Right.
So almost all the frameworks are all about how do I just manage the interaction between the state and my UI. And this is why it's probably won't get any much popularity if you plan on suggesting that to the front-end world.
Yeah, I mean, I might be able to actually take a stab on this. I'm working on a big, I think, proposal for UI re-architecture at work, and so I don't know, maybe there's something that can kind of come out from there. But I will say that, I think that the front-end community is very much subject to like the Pareto principle, 80-20, right? So I think like that's so funny. It's actually in your notes too. 80%, I think, of front-end apps, like their biggest pain points are state management, right? And I think the remaining 20% still have state management problems, but in addition to other things, right? And so I think for me, it's that 20% or 15% of applications at like massive scale that I would be interested in kind of, I think, codifying. So it's a really good takeaway from this conversation.
This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean, Droplets, Managed Kubernetes, Managed Databases, Spaces, Object Storage, Volume Block Storage, Advanced Networking like Virtual Private Clouds and Cloud Firewalls, developer tooling like the robust API and CLI to make sure you can interact with your infrastructure the way you want to. DigitalOcean is designed for developers and built for businesses. Join over 150,000 businesses that develop, manage, and scale their applications with DigitalOcean. Head to do.co/changelog to get started with a $100 credit. Again, do.co/changelog.
So we touched on logging in the first segment. We are going to talk more about it now because you have more things to say. Logging, metrics, open it up, Yoni, for conversation. What is the best practices here?
Yeah, so it's not coincidentally that many of the best practices are focused on ops, on operations, on production. I really believe that what I call production-oriented development is something that should be embraced more by development teams. And one of the things that I think most projects are not doing enough is emitting metrics. And metrics are meaningful, measurable pieces of information that the application share outside, usually with the ops, production, monitoring guys. And this allows to monitor and measure and alert when certain meaningful events happen. And for example, it might be the amount of errors. Right? If we know that there is an increase in the error rate in the last 20 minutes, something is probably wrong. It might be the event loop delay in the last 1 hour. It might be also completely custom business metric like payment failed. Instead of doing also this, developers mostly rely on logging, which is important, very important, but logging are not good enough for this type of thing because first, there are a big bulk of text. So if I'm as an ops guy, looking at the application and looking at the logs, it's very hard for me to extract what is important. And if I try to, what many are doing is just trying to scrape some text and extract events based on this. But then if a developer changes just one word, it all breaks. And not only that, usually log lines are not measurable. It's not numbers. It's also not documented. Who documents his log statements? It doesn't make sense. Metrics are the solution to this. A few, 10, maybe 30 specific events that are documented by design, whatever framework you're going to use, it's very clear to your ops what your application is going to emit. So it's kind of an interface between the dev and the ops. And practically, it's very easy to do it. As a developer, you just throw a plain JSON with an identifier. Usually it's a counter or a specific numerical value. It has a name, sometimes it has labels. There are many supportive frameworks for this, like Datadog or Prometheus if you're into the Kubernetes era, or CloudWatch if AWS is your thing. It's really easy. It's really powerful for the ops, and yet not enough are doing this. So I think it's an opportunity for many projects to embrace metrics.
How do you decide what specifically you want to have metrics around? Like, is there guidelines that you follow for that?
Yes. So I'm putting aside infrastructural metrics because it's more about a development show. So the ops don't need us, the developers, to throw infrastructure like disk space, out of disk space, CPU. There are tools for this. No need to. So in your code, type of metrics that you want to throw are of two types. One is your platform specific metrics, because your ops, you know what I would say first, your metrics should reflect what is important to measure and alert on. So usually it's platform specific measures, like if you are a Node.js, the ops guy don't know about the event loop and how sensitive it is. So platform specific in Node.js, it will probably be something like the event loop, the open file descriptors, usually also the HTTP request behavior, length of an HTTP request, amount of HTTP request, amount of errors, very important. This is one category. And the second one is business metrics, like business or product metrics, stuff like payment failed, really important stuff. Payment failed. Wow, we really want to measure this. Mm-hmm. If there is an increase in payment failure, then obviously someone has to go online and watch.
I think I'm so glad we're talking about this, because for me, so first of all, logging and monitoring of any kind has a cost, right? And I think I've seen a lot of developers fall into a trap where they overlog, and then once their application scales, it's like, what's going on? Why are my server bills so high? And or why are things slow? Mm-hmm. So understanding that monitoring and logging have a cost, and then making sure that whatever tools you're using to do logging and monitoring meet high performance benchmarks, right? So I wouldn't be using Bol, for example, as a node logger anymore when things like Pino, Pino, JS exist, right? So ultimately, it's one of those things where you really, the kind of the maintenance part of this as a developer, I can tell you the way I've kind of handled this is I typically have an abstraction around my logger.
Totally.
Right. So I created my logging interface in my language, my class, my code, whatever, my set of functions, my module, and, whatever tool I'm using is abstracted away in there. And what that gives me is a lot of flexibility to move with the best tools as they become available, right? And as benchmarks improve, there's no loyalty here, right? The only loyalty is speed when it comes to monitoring and perf. So there's that. Although Pino has set a really high bar, and I think Matteo is only going to be continuing to innovate. I think Matteo Colina, who we should have on the show sometime, by the way, he's going to be on our show pretty soon, the Web Platform Podcast. But Matteo has this unique advantage where he's a maintainer of a lot of popular Node libraries like Fastify and Pino, but he's also on the Node technical steering committee. So he has this unique advantage where he is able to leverage his understanding of the internal workings of Node to do performance optimizations. I think that's super cool. But anyways, so getting back to the decision making around performance as a cost, you also have to understand that what you're monitoring and what you're logging also fall into two different categories, right? So there's, like you said, there's the business intelligence type stuff, new user, transaction happened. And then there's metrics around health and performance, which how long are your requests taking, et cetera. And so I think for me, the management of those two, and then deciding on what to log and how often to log and what verbosity and what your debug path looks like in production, those are really big decisions. And I still haven't found a way to codify and organize it so that I can have a very seamless interaction or seamless set of communication with ops, that's actually doing this monitoring and setting these benchmarks and setting the bounds, right? Do you have any kind of feedback on this? Who's done this well? Are there tools that you can use? I'm thinking of infrastructure as code, right? There's no infrastructure as code equivalent to fixing this problem and organizing it and codifying it and like making it easy to communicate. The only thing I found that has worked for me in the past is to, like I say, create my own abstractions and centralize my own, create my own modules that can at least like limit the points of change, you know? But other than that, I don't know.
What's fallen down with that, Amel? I do that as well, and I find that it's like a really good pattern and it just works. Have you found limitations with that, or you just don't want to do it every time? Or
No. I just think that Yoni brought up a really good point about your ops team. It's like you need to be in communicado with your ops team, right, on this stuff. And so ultimately, like, what's that process? Like, the only thing I can think of is like a manual human process.
Yeah.
Right. And I just wasn't sure if there was like a programmatic way to do that in a consistent way. Like, that's all. I'm trying to over optimize. Is what I'm doing here.
Well, so. Nick's probably written a robot to talk to his ops teams. Haven't you automated that away, Nick? You don't have to talk to anybody anymore. You just tell your robots to.
I wish.
Sorry, Yanni, you were about to say something before I picked on Nick again.
No, to Amal's point, I think that, Amal, you just kind of packed few great and very useful best practices. First, always create a wrapper around your logger and anything that is external. And also separate the verbosity of your log entries. So do info level logs on major events like start of a request, moving to another layer. And anytime we'll write these huge messages with custom variables, keep it verbose. It's really, I even agree about Matteo Colino, which has a genuine skill for taking things and making them somehow so much faster, amazing. And one more, now to kind of combine metrics and logging, although they answer different questions, but many times what I hear from developers is, okay, I understand why metrics answer a different question. It's not about investigating a specific flow. It's about getting a sense of the overall system health now. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to present now new infrastructure, a new transport layer. Anyway, I'm doing my alerting on CloudWatch or ELK, so I have logging. So great, it's a good point. You can use logging for metrics. My advice then would be create a dedicated method for metrics. So like you have logger.log, logger.info, have logger.metric. And there have a very specific variable, metric name, metric value. And next time a developer comes to change something, he probably be cautious about changing this line, the metrics, because it knows that this specific log usage is a direct contract with the ops. So it's a kind of good balance between using our convenient tools, the logging, but making them a bit more ops-oriented, shall I call it?
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good idea. I love that. I think that actually gets me one step further than my process right now. So that's great. And thank you for highlighting that I called out best practices. I pride myself on best practices usage. In fact, if I could have my middle name be Amel Best Practices Hussein, I would legally make that change. Just one last point to kind of further drive this automation home. As you can tell, like I'm an optimization nut. You can actually use ASTs or something like that to either have something as part of your pull request check, right? So anytime somebody adds something new or removes something that's logger.metric, you can have a Slack channel notification. You can have a backlog ticket that's put for the ops team. Like you can put that into somebody's queue for review, right? So what you're doing is kind of taking away some of that gatekeeping around process change and kind of flipping the switch into like just having a monitoring process for process change. And that way, if you need to swoop in, you can. But if you don't need to, like full steam ahead, right? So, and that's something I personally I'm embracing that model. Like I just realized I'm in a principal software engineer role right now, and I want to enable developers to work quickly, but also with convention and standards. And so I'm using that kind of methodology to like monitor, but not get in people's way, and only get in people's way when I need to, if that makes sense.
I love that. That's the robot right there.
There it is.
It's talking to ops for you.
Yeah, totally. So there you go. Thank you so much. We fixed this problem, ladies.
We fixed the bug.
You're welcome.
So anything else on writing code best practices? We have a lot to say about security, so we're going to skip right to that unless we will have any more on this topic. Of course, there's more to say, but for this particular podcast.
Standout. I just had questions on like standout, standard, versus like there's one more I can't forget.
Standard out, standard error, and standard in, but that's the other direction.
And yeah. And is different. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I don't know. I guess any light to shed there, really briefly, Yoni.
Yeah, so you're referring to the best practice as it is called log to STD out.
Right.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of a common wisdom for many developers. The idea is that anytime you log, your medium is not a file or a database. It's the STD out, the standard output or error. I don't differentiate now between the two. Is the standard output of the process, because then at the production, at deployment time, there is someone, maybe you, maybe someone else. We always plan at least in advance that it will be someone else. Could be bridge this stream into his convenient log aggregator system. Maybe it's ELK, maybe it's CloudWatch. We don't want to make this a code decision. However, when the most popular logger for Node.js for years, at least until recently, Winston, in almost all of his examples, they were showing how do you log to a file. And to make it more tangible, if you log to a file in Kubernetes, it's so hard. It's so hard to extract all the files from all the pods and unify them. However, if you do it to STD out, it's just happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's another point where developers don't think in ops way soon enough.
Yeah, well, but there is a nuanced difference between standout and stand error, right? Like, and it has to do with, I think if I remember, like when your application is crashing, right? Like, and or blocking threads. And so can you maybe just like shed some light there, like briefly? It's a very important, it's more an advanced topic, but I think it's an important nugget for people to digest.
Yeah, I believe this distinguishment was made mostly for CLI application. Because in CLI application, you need kind of two feeds. One is what the user is the one who prints on the CLI, probably an administrator or a power user, what he sees on the screen. And on the other end, what the program prints when it exits or for diagnostics. So there was kind of separation. However, in backend application, which was this is the context I used here, in backend application, this distinguished doesn't make a lot of, at least is not very useful. So this is why I didn't differentiate.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to go by the book, STD error is the target for...
Well said. A lot of times in services we'll wrap those two up, and there's no differentiation in where those actual entries go. Like if you're sending them over to a paper trail or something like that. So definitely makes sense on the command line though, as you have certain things that you want the person to see regardless of something going wrong. Like they asked you for an answer and you give them an answer, and then perhaps they ask you for an answer and it's an invalid question, and you log that to standard out to standard error versus standard out.
What up, JS Party people? It's your boy here, Adam Stacoviak, and I have a question for you. Are you having trouble uncovering performance issues in your Node.js apps? If so, check out our friends at Scout APM. That's scoutapm.com/changelog. Scout is application monitoring that automatically reports key Node.js monitoring metrics, instruments many Node.js libraries automatically, detects easy to miss N+1 queries that sneak into production, plus a ton more. And of course, Scout is easy to install via npm package. Learn more and get started for free at scoutapm.com/changelog. No credit cards required. That's scoutapm.com/changelog.
Okay, let's turn our focus over to security because there's so much to say here. And this is a place where many of us know a thing or two, but not everything. And even if we think that we have a good grasp, there's so many ways you can shoot yourself in the foot and accidentally write insecure code or deploy things in an insecure way. And surely there's lots of best practices around that. You have a whole section in the repo on security best practices. So let's pick a few and talk through them. Yoni, what are some globalized best, like everyone should know about these, don't do this or do this kind of security practices?
Yeah, well, I try to pick some interesting security practices that kind of reflect on the complexity of configuring our application security. The first one is that you should hopefully inspect for outdated packages. But the important question is, how soon should you update your packages? Because one common sense believes that, yeah, we should always update as fast as possible, right? We want to get the latest and greatest as soon as they become available. But what we have seen in the industry in the past 2 years, at least, is that most of the security breaches, the hilarious NPM security breaches, were discovered by the community in, I tried to calculate this, it was around 30, maybe 30 days. So if someone waits before updating 30 or 40 days, you're greatly decreasing the chances of you are affected by some new security breach in NPM. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the infamous event stream incident.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. Maybe a quick recap on this?
But our audience may not be. Yeah, for sure. We did have a conversation. There's a show about this back in December of 2019 when it happened, Nick, if you recall. I think it was you and I and Faraz talked about Event Stream. We even had Dominic on. Maybe it was on the changelog. Anyways, we've covered this topic, but it's been a while, and even I don't remember the details. So please do review it for everybody.
Yeah, so shortly, there is a new, very popular type of attacks, which are called the supply chain attack.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is, don't try to intrude into someone's production that's hard and complex. Instead, just socially become a friend of a maintainer, become one of the maintainers of a package, and then you get infinite power. So in Event Stream is one of those very, very popular packages. I believe it was downloaded 8 million times a week or a month. Can't remember, but it's not really maintained anymore. There's not much to add to it. It just works. And at some point, some new maintainer kind of show intent to start contributing and got the trust of the core maintainer. And then for a start, he does a lot of useful stuff. And at some point, he injected a new dependency into the code. Nobody noticed, and this dependency was a very malicious one. I believe it tried to steal some Bitcoin files from the local developers. But the important point here is that it affected, I believe 8 million people downloaded this package until it was discovered around 30 days later. So those who waited, those who are patient, benefit. So the bottom line here is that keep your code updated, but maybe some kind of grace period before you do that.
So I'm so glad that you're bringing this up, because we should put this tweet in the show notes, Jared.
Okay.
One of my really good friends, who is the former CTO of NPM while I was there, and literally we were making fun of Dependabot yesterday. We were saying, like, if you don't if you're not updating your repo 6 times a day via Dependabot, like, can you really call yourself a developer? Right? So and while I was at NPM, one of the things I worked on was like updating the unpublished package feature, right? So we actually gave a little more autonomy to users. Like, we extended out. We can link to the blog post on that as well. So now you can unpublish packages with a little bit more of a grace period and more like leeway if you meet certain criteria, right? So we just kind of took a first step at like widening that. And there's a lot of headache to get that feature out. It's a very sensitive topic, right? Like, once you publish something, in theory, like, the NPM registry is like this immutable thing. I consider it to be immutable. Like, in fact, Isaac, who is the creator of the CLI, and he said that, like, he regrets adding the unpublished feature into the API, right? Because it takes away from the immutability.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was at NPM, like, there's tons of like security packages that get removed from the registry. Tons of, if something malicious, like, we remove it, like, it's right. So it's gone, regardless of who was downloading it or not. And so, I am very much in the favor of being one major release behind for everything. Like, I just think it's, living on the edge is just too much churn, the bigger your engineering team, right? Like, the more you have at stake, so for me, that's the rule that I use. I like being one major version behind. That gives enough, especially with the NPM ecosystem. Like, there's enough dependencies on the dependencies, like your dependencies have dependencies and peer dependencies. Like there's just too much interlocking and giving, and like the more time you wait, the more everything is going to just work, together in a seamless way, versus like upgrading your Webpack config or upgrading your Webpack, and then all of a sudden, Babel still hasn't caught up, or they're still fixing bugs, like why take that cost? Like I think our obsession with like new is something that we need to like acknowledge as a problem and actively curb in our community. Like it's just unhealthy, and it promotes like unsafe code practices as well, just like Yoni just highlighted with the FS events.
Yeah. So stay a version behind. I think that's a pretty good practice. I would also
major version.
I would also limit your dependencies, right? I mean, limit and scrutinize your dependencies is an actual practical takeaway here, because the problem with this kind of a exploit, right? We talk about the different kinds of exploits. This one, a supply chain exploit, is you are not in that supply chain. You, as a developer, you're just sitting over there minding your own business. You're dependent upon the supply chain. What can I actually do as a person typing into my terminal and my editor to guard myself against this problem? And really, a couple of things you can do is stay a version behind, or a major version if you're very paranoid, at least a patch or a minor version, and limit and scrutinize your dependency, because while you didn't write that code, you don't maintain that code, you don't know where that code came from, the buck does stop with you. It's your code once you execute it and run it. So the only thing you can do is limit that attack surface and verify, that you're using dependencies that are reliable and maintained, and be aware of what's going on around you, which is difficult to pull off, but necessary in this ecosystem.
Jared, you're a man of my heart, really, because I can share some insight on this. As someone who's been a lead engineer for a while, like when evaluating new tools and libraries, my personal rubric, which I should probably write a blog post on because I think this is useful to more people. An element of my rubric involves looking at the dependency chain of the tool that I'm like going to install, right? So for example, you look at something like a Lodash module, it's just pure function, no dependency. That gets a high score for me on that's a plus, right? If I look at a module that is like not doing magic rocket science, but it has like 71 dependencies, like I'm not into it, right? Like I would rather find a tool that's like more static, and like even if it's not as well maintained, like I will use that over, just adding 71 new sub-dependencies into my project, And so ultimately, like there is a process and there should be a rubric that you have based on your business needs and goals as a team or as an engineering org when adding new dependencies. And, that rubric should include like how many things, as like who else am I getting into bed with, or who else am I marrying when I npm install save, right? Because you are, just like Jared said, you are responsible for maintaining that code, whether you like it or not. And node modules are absolutely the heaviest objects in the universe. So
right. Let me do a shameless, not self-promotion, but self-show promotion. There's an excellent JS Party episode. Nick, you were on it. Episode 56 called We're Dependent. See? And it's Safia and K-Ball and Chris and Nick. And they discuss at length how they decide, like that rubric, their own personal rubrics. They go in deep. When and how to select a third-party dependency. And that episode is just filled with wisdom. So I'll submit that to the listeners to go and check that one out. But then also, I feel like this kind of this dependency selection process is something that needs to be blogged and like referenced.
And codified.
Yeah, because you do it enough over time, it almost becomes intuition. Like I can sense when this is a bad idea, but that's just because I've internalized my own rubric, right? Like I know what to look for. And Amel, you know how to look for what to look for. Over time, you develop this sense of what is a good or bad choice in that regard. But these things can be enumerated and explained and scored, and you could actually have very useful transferable knowledge that way.
Yeah, or hire Yoni, if you have the budget.
There you go.
Thanks for promoting me, Amal.
I hope one day to hire you. I'm not kidding. I mean, it's extremely valuable to get like external feedback and on penetration testing and security best practices. It doesn't matter how good of a team you are. Like you have bias. Like Like I have blind spots. We have blind spots collectively, and
So that's supply chain problems. What about the problems that we introduce in our first party code? Because we have a much more direct relationship with that, and there's things that you can do to avoid that kind of attack, right? There's SQL injection, there's cross-site scripting, there's all sorts of things that can happen right there in the code that you're typing out, Yoni. So what are your best practices around how to handle problematic input from your users that you weren't expecting coming into your Node app?
TypeScript.
No TypeScript this episode.
Nick, did you just say TypeScript?
No, never.
Never.
The ghost of Nick passed.
Yeah. So I guess that malicious or challenging input is a big topic. But first, I do agree with about TypeScript, but I would phrase it in a more generic way. This was a very important advice in Node.js land 3 years ago. Now it's almost common wisdom. You should have some mechanism of presenting the schema that you are expecting in the request. Whether it's a TypeScript or a JSON schema or class validator becomes now very popular with Net, something that should limit the attack surface. And it's funny, I think that I tried many times, at least until a year or two ago, to do a very, very simple attack against Node.js application. So you know that there is some post route, just send a custom JSON with other property. And a big portion of the application just crashed after this because someone was doing that. I expect some property dot other property, but it wasn't there. So there was an uncaught error. And so yeah, validation is obviously one tier, and there are linters that will catch things like SQL injection or ODM injection. One of the interesting stuff is once you know that you should get dynamic input from the user. So it's not a structured request with a specific JSON schema. It's kind of, free-form content, user type a comment. How do you treat that escaping of this string? Should it happen on the first tier before saving to the database? Should it happen on the upstream when we send back to the user? And one of the things that we learned is that this type of escaping should happen on the upstream. In other words, when you return it back to the device user that is querying for the information, because escaping is platform-specific thing. You escape differently for browsers, you escape differently for mobile applications. For some platform, you don't know how to escape. So typically, you should save in the database the raw information, obviously after you have ensured there's no SQL injection there. And if you use the right ORMs or tools, the wrappers, there shouldn't be an SQL injection. But generally speaking, the raw content should be stored in the database, and the sanitizing, escaping should happen as the content is served back to the user.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I'm just curious for me, I'm always amazed at how much bias I have, being a quality and performance and whatever obsessive compulsive person. I'm amazed that there's just basic stuff that I consider just that not everybody does, right? And one of those things for people who write a lot of backend services is schema validation via a tool like the OpenAPI spec, formerly known as Swagger. And just how important it is to have that for your requests and responses, because, even if somebody is adding something that you didn't expect, or you're able to catch that, log that, monitor that, and have it go through security review cycles or whatever. You can loop back, it's a life cycle event where having those things allows you to have that improved communication flow between DevOps and security, right, and engineering. And so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
You mean thoughts on the overall process of proofing your security level, or
Correct.
More specific?
Well, leveraging tools like OpenAPI spec as well to ensure there isn't drift on the contract, right, between requests and responses.
Yeah. So I'll start with the OpenAPI thing. So I'm sure Nick will be pleasant and already aware that there is a great movement in the Node.js ecosystem toward more structured things like TypeScript And Nest, with Nest.js, now it's much easier to introduce Open API and get upfront validation of the Open API spec. Specifically, we will probably discuss it in the testing session, but there are also very neat testing tools that allows you to check upfront whether during your test, one of your requests violates the API spec, the Swagger, then it detects it automatically, even if your code didn't detect it and let it flow by, the test will discover it based on the network traffic. I would also mention the move to GraphQL as a very popular transport. It's all going toward getting that structure that we need. I would even argue that kind of attacking using some surprising input would become a bit more difficult for attacker now due to all of this.
Like the hardening of schemas and validation, like built-in validation. Yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm. I feel like for me, the industry here being like library authors and ORM developers and or, the services world, like we're heading into more like stronger defaults, right? Better defaults out of the box, right? And so like give power users flexibility, but also give novices less of a chance to shoot themselves in the foot. So yeah, it seems like we're heading in the right direction.
I think another way that we could move there together faster, better, stronger is to collaborate more. One of the things that I see inside our ecosystem is this ethos of like the indie dev with 1,000 NPM packages, right? Like one person, many packages. And that's amazing. And those people are amazing. But what can be more secure and maintained and sustainable is many devs working together on less packages, right? Because now we're bringing our collective knowledge. And even inside the security research field, there are verticals inside of information security, right? There's people with this particular niche expertise, and they can bring a different eye on a security question than somebody else, like somebody who understands cryptography inside and out versus somebody who understands databases inside and out and all the way that a database can be compromised. And so more people working together on less projects, which really comes into things like frameworks versus libraries, right? Teaming up on a framework has a lot of advantages. And one of those advantages is all of us looking at one code base versus me looking at thousands of little code bases. So that's just an idea I'll throw out there.
No, that's such a good point. We should blog about that, or we should do a show about that, Jared. Seriously, it's such a good show. Maybe we can have a panel of framework authors and talk about how like the collective makes them better. Yeah. And I think of Next as a really good example here because I think that like they've done a lot to kind of have those good defaults, right? So you don't have to like worry about performance and all these other things because there's like there's good rails for you, so you don't go off the rails, right?
Right.
So I just really quickly, Yoni, I wanted to ask you specifically for folks that are writing a lot of front end code, what are some common things that you see as like security faux pas that start in the front end and affect backends? Like commonly, I'm just curious, like are there, whether it's escaping CSS, HTML, JavaScript, or like how can folks who are writing front end code make less work for backend security?
Make less work. Interesting.
Less work, yeah.
Yeah. So just before answering that, I want to relate to something very interesting that Jerod said. And I think that Jerod's idea, and I'm getting back your point, Amal, at a second. What you said, I think, is a really strategic point in Node.js now, and it can be generalized to everything, not only security. It used to be, and I see it many times, I'm now building this Lego puzzle from many, many pieces, and I have to I'm overwhelmed by the amount of decisions and architectural stuff that I have to make decision on. The quality of every decision is diminishing. But now that we're starting to see mature framework like Nest.js, then not only security will become this pattern of many people looking at one code base, will be very beneficial, not only related to security, everything, performance,
features,
structure. Yeah. So
Chromium is a very good example of that. Chromium, formerly Blink, formerly WebKit or whatever. Like, I don't know, maybe not formerly Blink, but like formerly WebKit, right? So like it's like more than 1 million person hours, I think, of engineering time has collectively gone into making that browser rendering engine and all, it is not something where like nobody's going to write a new browser, right? Like folks like Brave forked and like added their flavor of features to that, but no one's going to put in the work. And Brave also, like they're constantly pulling from master, right? Like they're keeping up with Chromium and they pay the price for that. But I'm just saying that like that is a very good example of open source projects where lots and lots of people are working on one thing and collectively are able to like make it the best, right?
Mm-hmm. So wrapping up the conversation of what front enders can do, ultimately I will say that your backend has to be secure. The front end you cannot trust. Somebody could throw away your front end and send you whatever input they want via a proxy, via an HTTP, request creator curl. But there are things that front enders can do to help out. And one of those things I'll just throw out there is that they can validate inputs on their user's behalf in the front end. That will not stop the malicious user, but it will stop what most of us hit most of the time is users just using our product in ways that we did not expect and creating malformed inputs and submitting them via forms, which can definitely accidentally either hack your system. Yeah, you're going to probably accidentally hack somebody, but you can definitely DDoS or DOS somebody by causing their backend to crash. Yanni, any other thoughts from you on things front enders can do, or Nick as well? You do a lot of front ends and back ends, so surely you run into these issues where the front enders can help out the node side of the fence.
From my side, just to first to reiterate what you just said, I mean, there shouldn't be any trust between the backend and the front end in most of the time. So I don't see a practical way where the front end can actually
secure things,
help the backend maybe in realizing patterns. But there are two different teams, at least from security perspective. One of the challenges that it's not the front end to blame, but one of the movements that is triggering now more challenges to the backend is what I call the backendless pattern. But we've seen a lot of demand now that the front end will be the core thing with most of the code, where most of the innovation and changes happen. And the backend is kind of a much more generic thing that rarely change. Mm-hmm. You can see stuff like, for example, AWS AppSync or GraphQL. GraphQL is kind of a thing. Hey, backend, give me a very, very flexible schema. I don't want to ask any time for new API route, and I'll just, in my front end, can now get much more power. But then on the back end, you have to implement a much more generic and dangerous code. So for example, now if using REST, for example, I could limit and say, hey, you can only query for this entity using these fields. Now with GraphQL, the user kind of can traverse and explore my database, or at least my data provider, in a very free-form style. Of course that we have to limit this, and there are tools, but this need to create a very generic layer for the front end imposes many security challenges. If I should choose one thing to blame the front end for, it would be this one.
Wait, what's the generic layer? Why does the generic layer cause this issue? If ultimately there's no trust to begin with? Like, why does it even, like, ultimately, like, the backend is going to always validate its inputs and sanitize and do whatever. Like, there's no trust. So why would the front end cause any more burden in this regard?
You're providing a larger surface area. You're requiring a larger surface area.
Surface area. I understand. Okay. Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And in plain words, now if I have 4 database tables, and I used to know that if you approach this route, you just get data from this table, querying by 2 fields. Now, using a single endpoint, because GraphQL is a single endpoint, you can query something that I don't really predict from my from all of my tables using some kind of relations. Of course, that we have tools to limit this, and we absolutely need to limit this. Mm-hmm. But the entire idea of getting you so much flexibility is challenging.
It's a bigger challenge, absolutely. Well, one thing that was a challenge was fitting all of this amazing content into one episode of JS Party. You may be wondering, what about testing? You're not talking about testing. Well, We're punting on testing. We're going to bring Yanni back here soon, and we'll have a show on testing because it is a huge topic. In fact, maybe even a mini series will be coming your way soon. Holler at us if you're interested in the topic of testing. Holler at us if you don't want to hear about testing, because you have to eat your veggies, but maybe we'll mix them in with some other sweets as well. I don't know. This has been an awesome show. I've learned a lot, and I hope you all have too. Yanni, thanks so much for creating this repo, for maintaining it. Of course, the links to Node best practices is in the show notes. Hop in there, give it a star, bookmark it so you can reference it, and hop into the issues and help out. Surely best practices change, they evolve. This is one person's thoughts melded with many people and his experiences. So as we get more people looking at it, more people contributing, we can really round it out and have a great reference for the entire community.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining me, guys. Any final thoughts from the panel?
Where can people find you on the interwebs, Yoni, and how can they connect with you and help you?
Yeah, so if it's related to the Node.js best practice repositories, and by the way, I have also a JavaScript testing best practices repo, then I'll really be glad if you approach me there, and it helps. There is a lot of learning while you write and think together about this stuff. And in overall, Twitter or the common social medias, you're welcome to approach. I'm a very nice guy, by the way. It was a pleasure. Quick promotion, we are publishing Docker and Node.js best practices probably next week.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll be glad if you pay a visit. And again, I hope to be here again. It was a real pleasure being here with you guys.
Awesome. Yeah, we appreciate Yanni. Amel, thanks for hanging. Nick, a pleasure as always. That's our show. We'll talk to you again next week. Did you hear? We are launching a membership program. It's called Changelog Plus, and we think it'll be super cool. Join the club for $10 a month or $100 a year, and if you move fast, you can get in for just $6 a month or $60 a year. That discount ends on September 1st, so join today to support our work, get closer to the metal, and make the ads disappear. Learn more at changelog.com/plus+. Once again, that's changelog.com/plus+. JS Party is brought to you by amazing sponsors. Thanks again to Fastly, Linode, and Rollbar for their continued support. And our beats are produced by the one and only Breakmaster Cylinder. That's all for now. We'll talk to you again next week.
Clap your hands, everybody, if you got what it takes. Cause I'm Curtis Blow, and I want you to know that these are the breaks.
We'll come back on testing code for its own episode, and we just continue on writing code, and then go straight to securing code for segment 3.
I like that idea better. I think securing code and writing code are a better pair
Tandem.
than yeah. But I think testing code could be its own show, and it deserves to be its own show.
Totally.
Like, you know what I mean? So yeah,
Totally.
I think that's a good idea.
I mean, it could be its own series because there's so much
for sure.
to talk about.
Yeah,
testing.
like multi-part. We could do like a series on testing.
Yeah, like the most boring month in JS Party history.
What are you talking about? This is it's a vegetable. I am all about my vegetables, okay? I don't eat enough vegetables in real life, but I sure as hell eat a lot of intellectual vegetables.
You know you're on the JS Party podcast, right? Like, you know, we play games and we debate things and we sing songs.
I know, but I just testing like doesn't get enough
No.
love, and I'm a testing nerd, by the way. So full disclosure, like big testing.
I'm pro-testing, and I've tested for many years.
Yeah, no, protesting is different than being a testing fanatic.
Okay, I never said I was a testing fanatic. I was just telling you that I am protesting.
Okay,
you know?
yeah. Okay, that's
But I'm also protesting too much testing talk. Ooh, see what I did there?
yeah. Well, you just have to be sneaky with it, right? Just like you have to hide vegetables.
That's right. You got to work it in. That's why I said the full series on testing is like we'll lose most of our audience. But if we sneak it in every episode, then we're just giving them what they need. You know.
You figured out my TypeScript model.
Yeah. Yeah, we're blending blending the broccoli into the chicken
We've been
nuggets
on to
batter.
you about TypeScript, Nick. You're not fooling anybody.